Hello guys, Art-Teeves here. In this short video, I'll share my 3ds Max flower improvisation idea, and perhaps one of the easiest ways to create water lily-like flowers for indie games. Let's get started. Now, is the flower I'm modeling unique? Absolutely not. However, I haven't seen an easier process for Max, so I wanted to share some results of my experiments with you guys. This particular low poly flower is curved and has depth, so it has a massive poly count of something around 300 polys, which is a lot, especially for a mobile game, but may work for an indie PC game. I'll also show you the way of reducing this number. I don't do any classic polygon modeling here. Basically, all I do is create a spiral, then create a spline, and then use a spline as a loft object for my spiral. Currently, the spline is positioned so that its middle part crosses the loft line. To avoid this, you can move the spline's pivot point to one of its ends. By adding extra vertices to the spline and bending it, you can create petal-like shapes. Additionally, you can adjust various parameters of the spiral, such as the number of turns, the overall height, the inner and outer radii. The loft settings offer further customization. For example, I've configured mine to use an organic curve, which helps define the natural contours of the petals. Make sure to set your spline's vertices to smooth when defining its curvature. If your flower appears darker than usual geometry, it means that its normals are flipped, so you may want to flip them back at some point. This way we get the high poly form we want. Next we can add some noise to it, and edit it manually the way we want. There is absolutely no need to trim down the poly count at this stage. Next I duplicate the flower. At this point you can experiment with curvature settings of each loft, and maybe add some extra settings you want. You can also add some noise to your model, or maybe experiment by moving some of its edges manually, creating something like a shell. Just don't make some parts that are much higher or lower than your average topology. Before you proceed, you may want to trim down some edges manually. Also, I've flattened the bottom part of my flower. Now, at this point I absolutely forgot to fix smoothing groups. You may want to assign a single one right now. Next I add a shell modifier and give my petals some thickness. The more time you spend adjusting your flower's shape, the better results you'll get. I'm only showing you the way of thinking here. My final flower isn't something I'd enjoy putting in a final project. Once I'm satisfied with my flower's thickness, I give it a few iterations of Turbo Smooth, nothing special about it. Then I position the duplicate I made on top of my high poly flower and trim down its poly count. It may have a really low poly count, but it shall still resemble the overall shape of the flower for it to bake correctly. Remember, the less curved your petals are, the easier it is to bake the whole flower onto a simple square, instead of creating a spiral like we do here. Now let me show you the optimized version of the same process. This time we are modeling the flower's leaves. They are flat, so we simply bake them on a plane split into 16 polygons. Why not a single polygon? Well, having 16 polys here allows us to maintain control of many vertices and add a slightly different curve to duplicated leaves. Once again, if you don't want the loft curve to affect the inner side of the leaf, simply center the spline you use for the loft to one of its endpoints. I give my leaves some thickness the same way I added thickness to my petals. Whatever we do at this stage, we don't want to alter the height and depth of our leaf too much for it to bake correctly on a flat surface. However, we may think of many weird things at this stage, like turning this thing into a cobweb or some other object we can bake onto that square. We will also be able to paint some holes in this leaf during the texturing phase if we so desire. I chose to simply split my leaves into separate objects, just to demonstrate one of the ways to arrange the process. Obviously we could have done way more. For example, play around with soft selection and some FFD modifiers. Next I repeat the process I've described when modeling petals. We trim down the poly count, cut things we want to cut, apply the shell modifier, and give our model a few iterations of Turbo Smooth. Obviously, if you create some really delicate elements, like the cobweb I've mentioned before, you'll need a higher resolution UV map for it to bake properly. If your leaves aren't round, it's better to bake a couple of their versions to rectangles, split those rectangles to something like 12 polygons, and position them manually after texturing a couple of them. Next I create stems. You can use polygon modeling here, or rely on lofts as I do. Lofts seem more convenient to me, because you retain control of their splines, and may alter them at any time. 3 sides are enough for most flowers, but if you want to increase quality, you may add a few. Still, I don't see any reason to go above 5. You may choose to cap them or leave them with open edges on their ends. In most cases, these things are barely noticeable. Still, making stems thicker seems like a fine idea since we're dealing with stylized flowers. I'll skip part of the workflow in this video since it's fairly straightforward. The key thing to remember is that because petals and leaves will mostly obscure the stems, we should keep the stem geometry simple, avoiding unnecessary detail, and use a single smoothing group for cleaner shading. Also, we can go 2D, or maybe stick to some weird triangular shapes and build stems with lofts, the same way we've built petals. Once again, I trim my geometry manually. Make sure to not create paths where your stem changes direction abruptly with a relatively sharp angle. These parts will bend hard on turbo smooth, and you'll have to align your low poly model to your high poly one. I check if all elements I've made have both low poly and high poly versions and are named accordingly. I never turbo smoothed my high poly stems, but nothing prevents you from doing it. Next I assign some smoothing groups and unwrap my low poly objects in Reason. You can obviously do it in any software you use to unwrap stuff. I pack my flower in 2K Reso with a padding of 16, purely for demo purposes. If I wanted to actually use a 2K map, I'd definitely add more natural stuff to it to occupy all available UV space properly. Finally, I bake my high poly model onto my low poly one in Substance Painter. I set the highest possible amount of rays on all tabs, write proper suffixes to match HP and LP elements, set my subsampling to 16, and enable the opacity channel. You don't have to use Photoshop at all like we did before to create alpha. Next we go to the Shader Set Settings menu and switch our shader to PBR Metal Rough with alpha blending. We also want to enable the opacity channel for our model. Next we create a fill layer and only use its opacity channel to fill our model with the opacity map generated by baking. If you have some hand painting skills, it's probably better to skip using Normal's map entirely. Maybe you can also exclude the roughness map, because you can simply paint everything you want to paint. If you want to texture stuff with grunges, you can always switch their projection method to spherical. This way you'll get the effect like the one I've used. You can move the sphere when you select the mask you have applied. The rest is up to you. Make sure to experiment with gradients and grunges affecting edges, and probably add some ambient occlusion. If you want to use normals, you can reduce the height of the fill layer you use and play around with its styling, the way I did in the video. Finally, make sure to alter your environment settings now and then to see how the lighting affects your model in different weather conditions. After I'm satisfied with my results in Substance Painter, I go to 3ds Max and assemble my flower. I merge it into a single object, put its pivot point to the center of its bottom part, and position it to 000 scene coordinates. What I really like about this method is the fact that you can experiment with many parameters instead of just using polygon modeling or sculpting. Loft seems like a really convenient tool to generate some initial geometry that can be altered the way you like. If you still want to sculpt over it, you can obviously do that in software you prefer. If those 300 polygons seem like an overkill to you, you can simply reduce the spiral's height and bake the flower to a much more simple object, like those polygons we've used for leaves. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like my videos, be my guest and subscribe to my channel for more stylized content. And most importantly, have a great day.